Hi, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for our webinar, Using Technology in Social Finance to End Modern Day Slavery. It's a part of our Impact series on how to make a difference using capital. It's April 12th, auspicious day. Randy Newcomb, one of our speakers, and I are celebrating our birthday. So we want to give you a sense of what Oxford looks like. And it is absolutely magnificent, except today it's raining. So imagine being here with the sun shining and seeing the spires of Oxford. We are singing and enjoying the day, but it is raining and cold here today during the school social enterprise. The Impact series is really designed to help our participants and actually our students really begin to understand social finance solutions to the world's most complex issues. And we're living in challenging times. It gives us an opportunity to talk about groundbreaking ideas and tap the talents of our global network. We're live from Said Business School. And again, Said Business School is one of the most innovative and creative entrepreneurial business schools in the world. And we're really our curriculum is designed to help students address the world's most complex issues. We actually offer 3 programs, one in social finance, one in impact investing, and one in impact measures. And it's an opportunity for students who participate in our programs to really understand holistically how these creative finance tools can be used to create systemic change, to deal with complex issues, and to find solutions at scale. We work across the ecosystem from philanthropy to impact investing and social enterprise to for-profit business models. Again, deploying capital to find creative solutions for social change. We work with the most wicked problems, and we seek to untangle those by using a UN human security frame, which is also tied to the SDG goals. So when we think about how money can be deployed to address personal security, economic security, community security, environment, education, food, political security, and health. So when we teach social finance, impact investing, and our impact measurement class, it's really to look at those interconnections between issues, whether it's personal security, as we're going to talk about today in terms of addressing modern day slavery, that's closely tied to other issues, climate change, migration, poverty alleviation, lack of access to food, political insecurity. And so today we're really going to focus on, again, addressing the issue of modern day slavery and the web of challenges that colleagues who are using capital creatively wisely move into the space to address political unrest, climate change, migration, poverty, and gender inequality. Oops. This is actually part of a series that we're doing on. First session was part of tackling the refugee crisis, and the session today is finance for ending modern day slavery. Our guests are Randy Newcomb, President and CEO of Humanity United, and Tristan Forrester, founder and CEO of FSI. We're going to start with a little overview, allow our panelists to talk about how they're approaching modern day slavery, the challenges and solutions, and then open up to question and answers. We have a really remarkable community online today. We have more than 200 registrants from 7 continents and 40+ countries. This particular image represents our community of practice for impact investing and social finance. It shows you the diversity of perspectives in the room when we come together to talk about solutions and challenges given cultural context and the flow of capital. So that's Gail Peterson, that's me. Tristan Forrester is looking very smart, and Randy Newcomb on his birthday is looking fantastic. I think let me put some context, and I wanted to add a little levity because this is a very serious topic. There are 40 million victims of modern slavery today. 24 million are in forced labor, 15 million in forced marriages. 71% are women, 29% men in modern slavery, and 1 in 4 victims are children. These are serious issues that have impact across the supply chain. They're in our communities, locally and globally. And one of our colleagues, actually a registrant, asked some questions before the session to really talk about the issue of slavery in the apparel industry, and that many of our own purchasing behaviors in buying clothing that's inexpensive actually feeds into underpaid workers who are modern day slaves. So we're going to talk about that and address those issues in our conversation. But I just wanted to let you know we're listening, we're hearing, and just as importantly, providing solutions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tristan to begin his presentation. Thank you.
Gail, thanks very much indeed, and greetings everyone from sunny Norway. I'd like to just do a quick introduction to FSI before I then get into some specific context that I'll be talking to as I go through my points for the next 20 minutes or so. So FSI is a workforce solutions business. We recruit and manage migrant workers largely through a fair labor model. And it's very much this ethical recruitment and fair labor model which is special about FSI. FSI's purpose is to end debt bondage. That is very much our focus. If we go to and I'll explain a bit more about fair labor shortly, but if we could go to the second slide, just to explain a little bit more about the context. I'm very much going to be talking about within the spectrum of modern day slavery, the 16 million people around the world who are victims of debt bondage and forced labor in the private sector. Our business is very much focused on those migrant workers deploying from the developing world into particularly places like the GCC, who end up in very significant debt bondage, meaning that they are paying large amounts of money to agents in the source country in order to get their jobs overseas. Could we move to the next slide? Just to paint a little bit more of a picture as to how FSI got involved in this. We originally, I was a British Army officer in the Gurkha regiment, had a deep love of Nepal and learnt to speak Nepali as part of my service in the Gurkhas. And we got into the battle against modern slavery by accident. It was very much, I was in Nepal, understanding while I was there that many people were ex-Gurkhas, were being charged huge amounts of money in order to get their employment overseas. And this was my introduction to debt bondage. From that point on, we decided we were going to set up a business that could protect these Gurkhas from being captured in debt bondage rather than being able to move overseas and work freely. And indeed, you know, after a lot of struggles, in 2 years, we managed to set up an infrastructure in Nepal that enabled us to recruit people ethically, despite the environment being very much set against us. So that was how it started. Now we are very much a business looking to recruit people from Nepal, India, Kenya, and other source countries into the newly industrialized world, but through a process where they are properly protected. And that's across all industries. So as you may imagine, construction industry is a huge challenge, and Qatar has been in the news very much recently, and a bit more about Qatar and the UAE later. So this is how we came at the problem, and to talk a little bit more about the issues. So what happens very much is that at the village level, people are immediately, particularly low-skilled workers, captured in a cycle of corruption and exploitation, where even at the village level, people they know, or agents, dalals as they're called in Nepal, charge them money to link them up with a manpower company in generally the capital city. That manpower company will then charge them extra fees to link them up with a job overseas. As you can see from this slide, 90%, 91% of low-skilled migrant workers operating across the Gulf tend to end up in some form of debt bondage, some of it very serious. And sometimes they're borrowing money from families, and it's their own funds that they're spending and paying to the manpower companies. Very often, they are taking out very large loans, 40% interest and more, with these manpower companies, and hence getting themselves into the debt bondage. The second issue, of course, is duplication of contracts, where they're told at the village level they're going to be earning $500 a month. When they actually get to the work site, they realize it's much, much less than that. So the period of their debt then extends even longer. And many of you will be aware of the other elements of exploitation, but particularly the restriction and holding of passports and travel documents. So even if people did want to leave, it can often be very difficult for them to do so. So this really is debt bondage, and this is how it manifests. Perhaps if we could move to the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the fair labor model in contrast to the debt bondage that I've explained. The debt bondage is absolutely ingrained across most of the migrant workers, as you've gathered. It is the norm. The workers themselves expect to pay money, and many of the players in the labor supply chain are taking money right up to, in many cases, the HR departments of the employers that they're working with. So a fair labor model, to just focus on those top 5 points, is all about protecting workers and allowing them to make informed choices, so that when they get to the work site, they're earning what they were promised. They have paid no fees for their recruitment and mobilization. They are paid the minimum salaries that they're guaranteed at the village level. That actually transpires when they get to the ground. There is no duplication or falsification of contracts. There's no retention of passports or travel documents. And there's a salary guarantee covenant. This is obviously a completely different business model. And if we move on to the next slide, just to talk through FSI's principles, the thing I want to say, first of all, is FSI was obviously built, and hopefully many businesses in the future will be built on the very principle of providing fair employment to people and protecting them from the village level right the way through their employment until they come back home. That is the model that should be being used right across the board. You know, these millions of people caught in debt bondage really shouldn't be there. There's no good reason for them to be there. Some people get involved in discussions around, you know, the cost of ethical recruitment is the problem. It really isn't a cost issue, it's a corruption issue. So businesses like FSI are built from the ground up to do things properly, to provide a valuable service to clients who are prepared to pay a reasonable fee for ethical recruitment to happen, and who can clearly see the benefits of having an ethically recruited and properly managed migrant workforce. So our principles are selection based on merit, that again, we have infrastructure at the village level that means none of those agents can get in between us and the people who are going to be employed with us. Secondly, we protect them through all of the mobilization and travel process to the projects, making sure that the medicals they have are proper bona fide medicals, that skills tests are done properly. In many, many cases, the debt bondage model, manpower companies put no effort into properly screening the manpower they send overseas, because in fact to them, and in many cases the people they're providing the workers to, benefit from a high turnover, because if people leave within a year or 2 years because they're exhausted or not fit for the job, then they go home, but the next person comes and clearly is paying that money to that corruption infected labor supply chain. So again, we have protections in place to prevent any of that kind of corruption touching the individual through their mobilization, selection, and pre-training. Then it's very much about welfare management when they are on the projects. So again, there is this attitude that workers are a commodity, that they are they are they are expendable. Indeed, there is this addiction to labour for the corruption reasons that I mentioned. Obviously, the FSI model and a fair labour model very much looks at training and empowering the workers to increase their productivity, a better business model that actually has bottom line benefits. And if there's questions people have, I'm delighted to answer those in due course. But it's welfare management on the projects as well, looking after the employee all the way through from the point of recruitment to working on the job to when they're coming home. Perhaps we could go to the next slide. The environment in which FSI is working is complex, challenging, and evolving. 10 years ago, when we started trying to sell FSI's ethical recruitment, fair labour services in the Gulf, to be honest, quite a lot of doors were shut in our face. Other people were more polite, said they fully understood that what we were doing was of great value, but could never see it taking hold because the corruption was too well embedded in everybody's methodology. So, and the mindset of the workers right through to the people conducting recruitment to the employers themselves. What I'm delighted to say is that there is an evolution of this environment, and we are now in Qatar and in the UAE seeing genuine opportunities for providing people on a fair labour basis at significant scale. Now, that has been helped significantly by developments both in the US and the UK, and shortly in France, and also in Australia, with the modern slavery legislation that is coming in the States, federal acquisition regulations, as well as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and in the UK, the Bribery Act overlaid with the Modern Slavery Act. What this is doing is really putting attention onto this issue and raising awareness, particularly of the C-suite of some large companies who can see that if they continue to be complicit in this debt bondage, that can be very damaging to their businesses. And with this development of the legislation, there is also, I'm glad to say, many more organisations starting to focus on exposing bad practice in labour supply chains. So nowadays, 10 years ago, as I said, a very, very tough sell. These days, more and more, there are companies who are starting to see the need to move to a fair labour model. Many of you may ask, and indeed, please do so, and I'm delighted to discuss it further. But when it is so obviously a good thing to do, and not only from a worker welfare perspective, but from a business profitability perspective, why is fair labour not more widely adopted? But the environment is evolving, and I'm happy to say in the right direction. We some years ago started our engagement in Qatar with the help of Humanity United, and managed to get some momentum there, initially only in a small way. But now perhaps we could move on to the next slide. And I want to just talk about how some of these opportunities are manifesting. I really believe that for fair labour to move to scale, you need to be targeting specific opportunities where there is both a government driver to achieve fair labour and also a business driver to achieve fair labour. And two areas to look at quite carefully are the World Cup in Qatar in 2022, because of the fantastic focus that has been put on the plight of migrant workers, building and ultimately who will be running the World Cup, because that focus has been incredibly useful in getting businesses to really think about how they're recruiting and managing workers. So both at a government level, we've seen discussions around changing the policies around how workers can be deployed into country and looked after in country, and whether they can move between jobs. The kafala system has prevented them in the past. But also below that, we're looking at a Quango level, so Q22 or Ashgal, any of these large organizations doing huge amounts of construction and running these projects are also now looking in detail about how they can drive their contractors to do a much better job around ethical recruitment and the management and treatment of the workers. So this, and also Expo 2020 in Dubai, you know, this is a huge event showcasing to the world Dubai's innovation in among other things, human rights and sustainability. So they are very much on the hook to try and innovate and do something meaningful around changing the debt bondage model. So I think this is two areas certainly we are concentrating on heavily, again, with the help of Humanity United and some other good people to help spread the word and wield the big stick a bit more heavily. But these kind of opportunities will be the ones where initial progress is made, and then hopefully as business more widely sees the benefits of a fair labour model, it will be taken up elsewhere. What I would like to just talk about briefly is a technology that FSI is in the process of developing that we're calling Fair Labour Link. The concept of Fair Labour Link is where we already have established infrastructure reaching to the village level, that we would like to use technology to help underpin that. The idea ultimately is that Fair Labour Link would, specifically for low-skill migrant workers, be able to link the worker up with employers who are committed to a fair labour model, and that their whole mobilisation from the point of recruitment through all the various skills testing and preparation and for their deployment overseas, everything would be captured and on the blockchain, on the Fair Labour Link system. There are huge challenges to the implementation of this, but we're committed to moving forward with it anyway, because even as a system to underpin our mandrolic, physical, ethical recruitment activity in the early evolution stages, it's useful. Ultimately, if it can disrupt all of us, if it can disrupt all the manpower companies and all the unethical recruiters out there, then obviously that would be an example of technology doing a seriously good job. I'm very interested to discuss further in the question time, you know, the challenges of technology and how it can be a major problem, because what it can actually do, if we're not careful, is become a weapon for the status quo, the corrupt status quo. And that clearly is something that we need to look at wherever we're applying technology to some of these ideas. I covered all of the sort of main points that I wanted to in my opening presentation, but very happy to go into more detail on any of those particular points in the questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Tristan. We're going to say thank you and shift to Randy.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much, Tristan, and of course, Gail, for hosting this really very, very interesting dialogue this afternoon. And what I will do is I'll pick it up from Tristan's setup around how we might approach using technology and the applications of social finance in modern-day slavery. And I see that we have many friends and partners from around the world, and many of you may be acquainted with Humanity United. But for others, let me just remind you that Humanity United is a private foundation. It was founded by Pam and Pierre Omidyar. Pierre Omidyar was the founder of eBay, and both the Omidyars have endeavored to use our resources to make change relative to some of the biggest intractable problems around the world. And most certainly, slavery is one of those. HU is also part of the Omidyar Group, which is a diverse collection of organizations, each guided by its own approach. but united by a common purpose and a common desire to catalyze social impact. So today, as we've queued up, we're really focusing in on forced labor and human trafficking, and you've seen the numbers and the extent at which forced labor and human trafficking has become almost pervasive around the world. The one point that I want to make before we get into the discussion of social finance and technology is that the current systemic barriers that exist for so many people around the world to live lives of independence and freedom must equally be met, I believe, with systemic-based approaches. I'm afraid that too often we're not taking those kind of systemic approaches to end slavery. We're dealing with issues around advocacy, perhaps, or other issues that really aren't getting to the systems orientation of the pervasiveness of forced labor and human trafficking. And I think some of the opportunities that are presented with technology offers a chance to think more systemically about this. Of course, you've seen these numbers in the last 20 minutes of our conversation. Just want to highlight, though, that roughly 150 billion of annual profits are generated from forced labor annually, which is significant and material. Let me turn to this next slide. And so in Humanity United's work, we endeavor really to work across workers, business, and government. And in this particular context, we believe that technology serves as a tool. It's not a solution, but it's a tool in which you begin to implement robust and effective ways to address slavery and the ubiquity of that among workers and the ways in which business may benefit or in some cases not benefit from slave labor and the ways in which governments are or are not paying attention to that. When we talk about the social finance solutions, I just want to quickly introduce, this is not going to be a new continuum, I suppose, to anybody on this call, but over the years we've come to understand that these kind of creative financing solutions include this entire continuum of finance. So arguably everything from traditional charity, which you see on the left side, all the way through kind of the impact investing, social enterprise work, all the way over to traditional business and commercial, the uses of capital and commercial applications. It's my view that we should be deploying these for the common good, that we should not use kind of the regulatory status, for example, in the US, to solely kind of eliminate uses of other capital and only approach this through a traditional charity model, but we should deploy that entire continuum of social finance to drive change. At Humanity United, when we talk about technology innovation, we to date have largely sort of bundled our work around what we think are three categories of emerging technologies that create this really new and exciting toolkit in the fight against modern day slavery. The first is kind of these worker engagement models, and this includes you know, the ubiquity of mobile devices that you just find globally that really literally give a voice to workers who were previously really just isolated and invisible to many businesses and to many activists around the world. Second is an exciting area around traceability. And of course, many have heard about the advancements with blockchain, some very exciting work that's beginning to emerge around DNA tracing. And then of course, the Internet of Things sensors and geolocation for data mapping and the like, all with the objective of creating greater transparency into supply chains that have been opaque in the past, where in fact the majority of worker abuse takes place around the world, as Tristan was so elegantly describing. And then lastly, there's this emerging category, which we all know about, around risk assessment and big data, aggregation, machine learning algorithms that are really introducing new tools around predictive analytics for early detection. So we don't find ourselves at the other end of the continuum where we're trying to respond to slavery, but where we maybe begin to predict and understand much further up the supply chains where there's risks for labor-related, those risks for labor-related activities take place. At Humanity United, just this year, we were pleased to close a fund called Working Capital, which is a venture fund, and as far as I understand, and I'm sure among our many participants on the call today, you may be able to correct me, but as far as our research tells us that Working Capital is one of the first venture funds that where a foundation serves as the general partner, and we have a number of limited partners that participate in this. But Working Capital is intended to be an early stage venture fund that invests to meet the growing corporate demand for scalable solutions to protect and empower vulnerable workers in global supply chains. So we're looking to bring the power of venture capital to begin to leverage new technologies such as those as identified around blockchain, Internet of Things, machine learning, and a variety of other tech solutions that are beginning to emerge in the 21st century. Some of these include examples. One of our first investments was Provenance, which is a UK-based company. And I think in terms of a social finance model, this really presents us with a really great case study. So our initial introduction on the social finance side was through some grant support that Humanity United provided to really begin to pilot the tracking of tuna from origin through to shelf, to try to validate labor-related claims associated with illegal fishing activity. So in my view, that kind of early sort of risky investment activity was perfectly aligned, in my view at least, for what much of philanthropy to do. Based upon that use case, Working Capital has in turn made an equity investment to support further expansion into additional high-risk commodities. And so this kind of relationship between grant making, which begins to test use case, and then perhaps de-risk some of this activity for follow-on investment with funds like Working Capital, I think, in my view, is a perfect example of social finance being deployed in a really robust fashion. Another area that, another tech solution that we've, tech tool, I should say, not solution, that we've participated in is F1 Soft, which is a very exciting fintech company in Nepal. And to Tristan's case, is really introducing a tool around a digital recruitment alternative to help migrant workers access employment overseas, to maintain custody of their papers, to create greater transparency for employers on the ground, to create greater accountability to the recruitment agencies in the middle. And it's a way that technology really forces far more transparency in a system that traditionally has been very opaque and has been open to significant abuse and the lack of accountability. And so I couldn't be more than delighted to be a supporter of F1 Soft in Nepal. And perhaps many of you will have questions about this. Another really interesting engagement for us has been some work with Catapult, OceanMind. And it's really an exciting relationship that exists, I think, right now between actors that are coming to the issues of fisheries, both through the lens of environmental and sustainability interests, but also through a lens of labor risk, labor abuse. And unfortunately, the conservation field and the human rights kind of labor risk fields have rarely intersected in ways in which they're supporting each other's common work. And we find in the fisheries work that increasingly the interests and the ambitions of the conservation community are lining up equally with the interests and ambitions of those of us who are working to address modern day slavery. And Catapult / OceanMind is ultimately a vessel monitoring system technology which provides data around analyzing vessel behavior and creates more transparency around how vessels might be engaged in illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing activities, which helps us better assess whether or not they're overfishing, whether or not they're using labor in ways that are not standardized according to the needs of the final consumers. And then another interesting application here is Apprise, and Apprise is just it's a brilliant and very exciting app that Humanity United invested in some time ago, whereby we really provide a tool for inspectors who are at port who are trying to determine whether labor is being used for slavery. And one of the hurdles there is the various different languages of laborers on these vessels, as well as trying to have a very efficient method to question and determine. And so this app simply walks labor and workers through a simple set of questions in their own language to be able to determine if in fact they're exposed or currently are at risk of slavery. And so finally, let me just make one last kind of push for Know the Chain, which is a Humanity United effort that exists within our organization. Know the Chain is a tool and a resource for company and investors to understand and address the risk within their supply chains. It's an online benchmarking report to help consumers better understand compliance relative to regulatory standards. It's really one of the world's first reporting resources, both for investors and companies that want to take it seriously about eliminating slavery within their supply chains. And I should say, lastly, here is the Gulf Construction Tracker, which actually just launched 2 weeks ago, and it's working in the same space that Tristan and FSI are right now, but it provides a really a much more transformative opportunity for people to track construction contracts across the Gulf, to begin to identify suboptimum employment and worker welfare practices among contractors that receive support for infrastructure projects, and to identify and spot trends and patterns that indicate risk for trafficking practices. So with that, thank you everybody, and I really look forward to your questions, and I will turn it over to our moderator, Gail. Thank you.
So I wanted to, again, before we turn it over to questions, and I think we've got some robust and provocative questions coming up, is to say we look at the systems, across the ecosystem of funding that's available, and the interconnected nature of conservation, climate, supply chain, migration. And that's the way we approach social finance, taking solutions to scale. So it's that innovative approach, and I think that we're one of the few, if not the only, business school that really tackles this in a comprehensive way around social finance. So we're going to turn it over to Brad Peaston to field some questions to our group, and to have some conversation about these very difficult and exciting opportunities for solutions.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, our first question is quite a broad one, and it relates to the numbers that have been highlighted by Gail, by Randy, by Tristan today. We have a question related to the calculation and the estimation of these numbers. Who would like to go first?
Yeah, sure. This is Randy. I'm happy to pick that up, and of course, Tristan and Gail may have comments on this as well. But of course, anybody who comes to this work knows that those numbers, there's quite a span, right? Obviously, and fortunately, we have colleagues like the Walk Free Foundation and others that are really working to be very systematic and sophisticated in ways that we continue to narrow down and identify clearly, methodologically, what are the numbers. So anybody who has been following this, and I'm sure the individual who has asked this question understands it, we'll see anywhere from as little as 25 million, if you will, and as high as 45 million. So that's a significant range, and I understand that. But the one thing I would say is that there's no doubt that there is scale here, right? And so that is what leads us to believe that until such a time we can really narrow down between the 25 and the 40 plus or so, that there's no doubt that this, in terms of scale, this is one of the world's most significant and intractable problems. And certainly as Humanity United comes to it, this is how we address that question of those numbers.
Great, thank you very much, Randy. Our next question is related to one of our participants asked, it seems to be implied that migrant workers are typically more vulnerable to slavery The individuals looking to explore what are the elements that are special to this group and some of the common characteristics that create the atmosphere for slavery in this particular group.
So I think that, this is Gail speaking, there are a number of factors. So for example, in the apparel industry, with migrant workers, it's one of the lowest paid industries, and it has easy access because there's large burnout and people making for example, in Haiti, a worker doing cut and sew work may make $5 a day, supporting 6.5 to 9 family members. It's not a sustainable lifestyle, but when you're poor and you're a migrant in a new country, it's easy for you to get wrapped up and into just trying to find a basic job. So that's one element, this desperation of where can I go? And unfortunately, cut and sew and the apparel industry offers those opportunities. Tristan?
Yeah, and really just to add to that, the process of migration itself, as Gail rightly says, there is this desperation in the developing countries for the opportunity to work overseas, where, you know, in many cases workers are able to go overseas and earn more than they can back home. But sadly, this desperation to be able to lift their families out of poverty is exploited by the manpower companies, by the agents in the destination countries, and by the HR departments of many employers. And therefore, not to belittle the issues that are faced within with workers within their own countries, but certainly migrant workers are specifically exposed to some of the worst corruption. And as Gail says, have across multiple industries, apparel, construction, and beyond, very little recourse once they find themselves trapped, which can add hugely to the individual specific suffering, but then indeed that of their families and communities.
Great, thank you very much, Gail and Tristan. Next question. Are there any tools that have been developed in conjunction with or by the tools intended beneficiaries or benefactors?
So from the ground up.
Yeah,
working with the ground up.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, let me come in on that, and Tristan, obviously you come in on this as well. But I know that I know of a number of tools that the design of those tools have followed more, you know, what we would call human-centered design approaches. So it's working within the communities among which those tools are intending to serve, that the developers have actually started there and have really endeavored to get feedback, to do early prototyping, to pilot, and then to scale those. And so many of these have followed a really interesting and I think important product development lifecycle. And so they've started really with that human-centered design approach, quickly, rapidly prototyping, piloting, and then scaling. So, and actually, I'd say that's increasingly common these days. And so, you know, it may have been even a decade ago we wouldn't have seen that practice, but I'm encouraged that certainly among the investments that we're a part of, that's something that that's a screen that we're looking for to better understand if it's been tested, you know, among the communities it intends to serve.
And just to be very clear in terms of the strategy that we use when we have our students in class, we begin from the ground up. And so it's a bottom-up development approach, and that when we have a learning platform that we use with our students, again, across sectors, across the world, to actually understand what it takes to build change from the communities within you, in which you work. And so it's a value chain approach from the bottom up, and the innovation that leads from large organizations down. So it's a both and. Tristan, any ideas, any other thoughts?
Only to agree with both of you, and to say it would be fantastic to see many more organizations other than Humanity United who seem to be shouldering most of the work in this regard, actually engaging at the sort of source country level, because there are some fantastic social entrepreneurs operating right at the bottom of the labor supply chain, utterly understanding the challenges and the context. And it would be great to see more philanthropic and indeed business investors getting on the ground and engaging with these people.
And the casework that we have actually for our social finance class begins at multiple levels, but primarily starts from the ground up.
You know, and I actually, if I can just jump in on this, I think this is such an important question, and my colleagues here, and I think partly what we see is some of the dysfunction of the philanthropic capital market, if you will, and the ways in which, you know, with all due respect, I think many foundation colleagues, traditionally American philanthropy at least, has tended to operate and to develop strategy within the regulatory constraints of the US. So meaning that if the IRS frames that work as within a solely charitable framework, then kind of the imagination to think outside that in ways in which, of course, meets the regulatory requirements, but also recognizes there's a whole range of ways that you can deploy capital that is far more ambitious than solely charity. And so this is some of the dysfunction that exists here, is that people are hesitant, they don't want to onboard the risk, they don't think about ways in which they can use existing capital, either the corpus or the capital that exists for deployment on an annual basis, to really drive more financial assistance and investment dollars down towards where these innovations are taking place. So, you know, hopefully over time in the 21st century, and with efforts like we see here with the social finance program, that becomes a tool that is deployed.
Great, thank you very much for the comprehensive answers. The next question comes from one on the ground in the construction industry in India. The gentleman asks, our interactions with construction workers in India has highlighted that when working on construction sites, sometimes workers' mobile phones get confiscated and workers are not allowed to leave the construction site, even after work. Are there any technologies to help with regards to trafficking exploited workers when they can't even access their own personal belongings and mobile phones that have been confiscated?
Well, this is you know, I've bumped into this multiple times, and this is the edge case that we're presented with, and I'll just be candid with our community today that when we move into these kinds of cases, this is where our colleagues that are working on the activist side, on the law enforcement side, that are trying to address constitutionality issues, this is where we need our friends and colleagues to be deeply engaged at that level, because there's very little we can do, certainly on the tech side, if we find that these mobile phones or other devices are confiscated, and it's very intractable, and that's where we need to be supporting folks that are working on those edge cases.
Well, and I also think that, again, when you enter into the social finance program, you begin to map out your partners at a local level to understand who's in your network that can buttress and support your capital investment and your strategy for change. So it's not in isolation, it's really understanding in a geographic location, in a particular industry, that really allows us to map out what a business strategy looks like. What's a social finance change strategy? So that in fact, you understand how to negotiate partnerships, both with workers and those employers, but also those organizations that are there to support you, whether it's the ILO, International Labor Organization, whether it's local advocacy organizations, so that you're not in isolation. And often what happens in the social finance arena when you've got a passion for an issue is you think you have the answer and your answer is the only one that's in play. And one of the things we do is really think about the ecosystem in which you operate. Who else has resources, both from a policy perspective, a legal perspective, and a community building perspective that will allow you to leverage your resources. So if we depend too much on technology, it can have a negative impact. So we're walking that fine line.
Great, thank you so much. Slightly different question. This is related to internal migration. So another participant in India asks, as climate change creates an exodus of agricultural workers in search of a livelihood, are there any suggestions for any methodologies to assess the magnitude in order for governments to get involved and take action?
So we actually have a case study that will be talking about this topic in social finance. And what we've also seen, for example, is an increase in suicides of farm laborers and workers because of drought. And so in this case, often their families are left without any resources. So we look holistically at what are the consequences of climate, both in terms of migration, in terms of people who are staying in community, and what does it mean for whole families in community? So the answer is yes, we look at those multiple, not only tracking, but what's the role of government and what are the obstacles for government to get involved? Is there a barrier to that? So we kind of blow open those topics, and it's a complex one, but we do actually have a case study that is targeted on India around this topic. So come to the class and we'll have an even more robust conversation.
You know, and I'd also say, this is Randy Newcomb, I'd also say that what I have found exciting to watch over the last 15 years now, working in the philanthropic space, is the emergence of more systemic and systems-based strategies. And so what social finance here at Saïd Business School at Oxford is trying to do, what we're seeing take place at various academic institutions around the world, as well as think tanks and writers and others around, how do we begin to move outside the silos and take a more systems-based orientation to these challenges that we face in the next century.
Great, thank you very much. I believe we have time for a couple more questions. Even though this next question's specific from a country context, I think it rings true to a number of migrant workers that are unbanked and paid in cash. The gentleman asks, do you believe or are you seeing any blockchain or technology-based solutions or organizations where they're trying to make an extended effort to move from cash-based wage payments to online digital-based ways of paying their employees?
Yeah, there's there's two parts to that question, and I'm going to ask Gail to pick up the second part, because I think she can talk about some of the risks that I think we should be mindful and thoughtful of around the unintended consequences. And at the same time, I can speak to, frankly, just near-term experience, having just been 2 weeks ago in a refugee camp along the Syrian border in Jordan. And many of you will be exposed to this, but UNHCR's innovation around using blockchain technology to distribute World Food Program resources to refugees. And of course, as we all know, this is a community that have limited papers, They have significant challenges around documenting identity and the like. And also there's, you know, the ways in which these resources have been distributed can be quite expensive. So UNHCR and WFP have instituted a blockchain technology that's based on iris scan that confirms identity without question, and allows for a more efficient distribution of finances. And also, before I hand this off to Gail, I want to say that they're also beginning to experiment the ways in which the blockchain actually introduces a credit and a savings history, which I think is perhaps even more interesting beyond simply distributing financial capital, but ways in which individuals that are unbanked, almost by virtue of the fact that they're sitting in a refugee camp, can begin to document a credit and savings history, which I think will serve them, you know, around financial inclusion in the future. But there are risks, and let me hand it off to Gail.
And I think that that's the other value of our community. And you saw the number of people who are part of the community and where we are. We talk very specifically about, we are pioneers in the field. There will be, when you enter into the world of complexity, there will be risks. And when you, as a leader, move into that space, you own those risks and you own the unintended consequences. So we always test and poke and recognize it's an evolution of learning. It's transparent, our own learning. And when I think about, we have many students who have been in impact investing who are actually banking the unbanked around migrant workers. And they're testing traditional finance, you know, getting roadblocks, hitting roadblocks with traditional banks, and looking at new technology. But with every step we make and every step we take in creative capital, we always need to understand unintended consequences and go back to that issue of the people whose lives we're trying to influence, whose margin of error and whose resilience is so small that we are, as leaders, obligated to be very careful and cautious and innovative, but always test our assumptions and be transparent about what we're learning.
Great, thank you very much. Got a couple of minutes left. Thank you very much for the questions today and your time. We really appreciate Gail, Randy, and Tristan's time on this very important global subject. I'm just quickly going to turn over to our the types of education that we've touched upon today. So as Gail mentioned in the introduction, we've got now a comprehensive complementary portfolio of programs focused in this area. We kickstarted that off many years ago before my time here with our impact investing program, which is running next week. It's been sold out for the last 4 years in a row. And it's been interesting from an observation point just to witness the growth of that program and to understand the types of organizations that are involved. So next week, we do have a group of 30 plus nationalities from across the world, all 7 continents represented. It's interesting to see organizations like Credit Suisse, Rothschild, a number of big players in the financial services and investment sides of the industry participate on this program. It shows that also in terms of seniority, it shows that these very important global subjects are reaching the levels at the C-suite and at the board level, and it shows importance as reaching all the way to the top in some respects. So we're fortunate enough to be welcoming in a group next week. But impact investing pretty much, it looks on impact investing deals as you would expect, but it focuses very much on, I would say, at the fund, deal, and organizational level. As that program growed and matured, we recognized, or Gail Alex, through his research, recognized that there was a greater need for global systemic issues to be addressed, looking at a variety of social financing mechanisms, all the way from grants to concessionary government loans, catalytic first loss capital, all the way through to impact investing and social venture capital. So we designed this program to look at the broader spectrum of social finance. As this evolves, there are more and more organizations involved looking to use their capital to the common good. So that program very much focuses on SDGs, as Gail is growing out her design. And we look at items like sustainable cities, climate change innovation, layered capital approaches. And as a result of that success, we've launched a new impact measurement program, which ultimately evidences and underpins our impact investments and the social financing that organizations are looking to make globally to create a very comprehensive series of programs here. So if you'd like to find out a little bit more about those programs, please feel free to contact myself, Brad Peaston, and Hannah Longford, who has worked with me now for 3 years. So you will have noticed Hannah's communications going backwards and forwards with regards to this webinar. So please feel free to get in contact. But most importantly, we wanted to thank you very much for your time today, to our speakers, to the attendees, to discuss a very, very important subject that needs to be addressed. So thank you very much for all your time. We really appreciate it. Please enjoy the rest of your evenings, your days. So thank you for your time. Thank you very much.